Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. They looked, they judged, they whispered, because she had white hair, simple clothes, and the quiet gaze of someone who had seen too much of the world. No one asked her name. No one offered help. At best, she got one of those forced smiles, the kind we give when we just want someone to go away. What they didn't know was that this woman wasn't lost. She was testing. And you? What would you do if you found out that the woman ignored in the reception area was actually the founder of the restaurant? That everything they were enjoying, from the space to the seasoning, had been born from her hands? This true story will show you that the greatest lessons don't always come from books. Sometimes they come from a simple gesture, like cleaning a chair. And that's where everything begins to change. That late afternoon, an elderly woman with white hair and soft steps walked into the restaurant unnoticed. She wore modest clothes, the kind that make you assume a hard life behind them. And that's exactly what the staff thought. Not knowing who she was, they judged her by appearance alone. The curious thing is, many people do that on autopilot, as if someone's worth fit within the label on their clothes. She stood for several minutes, ignored by glances that avoided direct contact. New staff whispered, trying to guess whether she was lost, or worse, there to ask for food. No one offered her a chair. No one asked if she needed anything. And all of this happened inside the restaurant she herself had founded. Can you believe that? The most powerful stories are often born from scenes just like this one. Judging by appearance is an old, and dangerous, trap. How many times have you avoided someone in a bank line, on a bus, or even at work just because they seemed off-brand? What if I told you that maybe that person carried one of the most transformative stories of your life? That ignored lady carried decades of memories, achievements, and resilience, but no one saw it, until something unexpected happened. While everyone looked away, a young waiter, recently hired, noticed the woman standing quietly in the corner of the room. He didn't know who she was. He had no information beyond what his eyes saw, but he chose to act from the heart. He picked up a clean cloth, approached respectfully, and carefully cleaned a chair. With a shy smile, he invited her to sit, the way you do when you see value where no one else does. That gesture, which could have gone unnoticed by many, is what unlocked an entire story. It wasn't just a clean chair. It was raw empathy. It was someone choosing to treat another well without knowing who they were. And that, my friend, reveals more about character than any resume or uniform. Life tests us in small details that reveal the greatness of our spirit. Have you noticed how true leaders often appear in the simplest moments? Not in titles or spotlights, but in actions like this. And here's the thing, that young man didn't act out of self-interest. He acted out of conviction. He didn't know he was standing before the founder of the restaurant, but he knew no one deserves to be treated with indifference. And that's where one of the most inspiring stories this restaurant had ever seen began. While the young waiter acted with respect, the rest of the staff kept an uncomfortable distance. They pretended to be polite, but a closer look revealed the disguised disdain. You know that dry good afternoon? That smile that doesn't reach the eyes? That's what she got. They handed her the cheapest menu in the house as if to say, this is what you can afford. It was formality without soul, empathy without presence. And this kind of behavior is more common than it seems. Many hide behind efficiency and procedure, while constantly judging others in practice. Offering the cheapest wasn't kindness. It was assumption. They assumed she couldn't afford a specialty dish, didn't even consider asking what she'd like. It's in these cracks that stories of disrespect are born. And luckily, sometimes stories of turning the tables too. Now tell me, how many times have you also fallen into this trap without realizing it? That time you underestimated someone for their clothes, their way of speaking, or for not knowing how to use a phone properly. It happens even in cafes, offices, companies. But the world is full of ordinary people with extraordinary stories. And sometimes, a poorly placed phrase is enough to waste the chance to hear one of them. Dona Alzira wasn't just an old woman with white hair revisiting a restaurant out of nostalgia. She was the living root of a legacy. She was the woman who, 4 decades ago, started with a borrowed stove, old pots, and endless courage. She prepared lunchboxes with such care that neighbors came not just for the food, but for the love felt in every spoonful. It was there, in her backyard, that she planted the seeds of what would become one of the most respected restaurants in the city. Every recipe had a story, every client was called by name, Every employee was treated like family. It was more than a business. It was an extension of her soul. But time, as always, went on, and with it came difficulties. Health issues forced Alzira to step away, first for days, then weeks. Before she knew it, years had passed since she last set foot in that kitchen. Management changed. The staff was renewed. The restaurant grew, won awards. But something was lost along the way. What was once essence became procedure. What was once warmth turned into protocol. And on an ordinary day, when no one expected it, Alzira decided to return. She told no one. She didn't arrive demanding recognition. She came in silence, eyes alert, heart open. She wasn't looking for applause. She was searching for signs that her story still pulsed in that place. She sat in the corner as she used to. She observed the staff, listened to the conversations, felt the atmosphere. But what she found was a cold environment. People too busy to notice who was around. Servers with scripted responses. Managers in a hurry to hit targets. And perhaps saddest of all, looks of disdain when seeing an elderly woman in simple clothes occupying a prime table. No one imagined who she was. No one cared. And that hurt more than any medical diagnosis she had ever received. It hurt because she saw with her own eyes her story being erased, not from the records, but from the living memory of those keeping the restaurant running. And that pain, unfortunately, is all too common for many who came before us. How often is someone who built the path forgotten on the very ground they helped raise? In companies, it's the founders who become relics, with no voice in decisions. In families, it's the grandparents who become burdens. In communities, it's the pioneers who become just names on plaques. But the truth is simple and powerful. Those who opened the doors deserve more than remembrance. They deserve reverence, not as worship, but as real recognition. Because no story can stand if it disrespects its own roots. And that's when a small detail changed everything. A young waiter, still in training, noticed that the chair where Alzira had sat had breadcrumbs on it. Unaware of who she was, he grabbed a cloth and gently cleaned it. He smiled, asked if she'd like a glass of water. A simple gesture, but full of presence. Alzira smiled back, and in that instant, she understood that not all was lost. The essence was still there. Perhaps dormant, but alive. That's when she stood up, adjusted her coat, and said in a calm but firm voice, "I am Alzira, founder of this restaurant." The silence that followed was overwhelming. The manager turned pale, the staff froze, and the young man who had helped her, he was promoted on the spot. But more important than the promotion was the impact. People realized the mistake. Not just the mistake of ignoring a founder, but of failing to see the human being behind an appearance. From that moment on, the restaurant changed. Not out of fear or guilt, but out of awareness. Alzira wasn't looking for applause. She was seeking presence. And by telling her story, she made everyone there reflect on their own. Because every person carries an invisible load. And when we judge only what's on the surface, we lose what really matters. The deeper layers that explain each gesture, each choice. A few days later, a mural was placed at the entrance, a panel with old photos, customer notes, images of former staff members. At the center, a phrase in golden letters said it all. Here, no one is too small to deserve respect, and no one is too big to not need humility. It wasn't just decoration, it was a manifesto, a daily reminder that the best stories begin when we truly see one another. And that transformation started with someone who had the courage to return, and with someone else who chose to act with empathy. Training sessions began to include modules on active listening, empathy, and intergenerational respect. Alzira's story became part of every new hire's onboarding. Gradually, the cold hallways turned warm again with real conversations. Employees started asking, "How are you?" Not out of obligation, but from genuine interest. Former customers returned with tears in their eyes, bringing back memories. New customers were welcomed with something rare, humanity. All because one woman decided to return, and one young man decided to see. And now here's a direct question for you reading this. How many times have you ignored a living story right beside you? How many times have you judged someone by their appearance without even imagining what that person has built, suffered, or overcome? This isn't just a tale about a restaurant. It's a mirror, and maybe without realizing it, you're living the same script, ignoring the roots that sustain your present. The good news is that it's never too late to change the ending. And it all begins with a gesture, a glance, a moment of true listening. So next time you cross paths with someone older, simpler, quieter, stop, ask, listen. Because every wrinkle carries chapters, every silence could be a cry of wisdom, and every person, regardless of title or name tag, has a story worth honoring. After all, what makes a place special isn't its walls, it's the memories they hold. And every time we forget that, we erase a part of who we are. On the restaurant's main wall there was still an old photo, a woman in a white apron, her hair simply tied back, and a wide smile on her face. Her hands were covered in flour, but her eyes sparkled. It was Alzira, decades ago, on the very day she opened that place. A photo that to many was just another decoration, one more frame among many hanging on the walls. But for those who knew how to see with their hearts, it was a relic. A portal to a time when everything there was still about dreams, effort, and passion. But the eyes of the new employees didn't know that. To them, that image was invisible. The story behind it had been reduced to a dusty portrait. Over the years, the restaurant went through many modern upgrades. The menu now featured sophisticated names, gourmet-style dishes, trendy ingredients. Uniforms were replaced with standardized, modern-cut outfits made of high-tech fabrics. The old solid wood tables, creaking with memories, gave way to minimalist, sterile furniture, chosen by a design consultancy. The walls were repainted in neutral tones. The smell of garlic browning and butter was replaced by artificial ambient scents. In short, the restaurant had been renovated, but in the process they forgot to preserve what mattered most, the soul of the place. It was as if someone had decided to renovate an old house and, in the process, threw away grandma's letters, love notes, family albums. What was meant to be a fresh start became a forgetfulness disguised as progress. Alzira, quietly seated in a corner of the house she had built with her own hands, watched it all with teary eyes. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was pain, because there, right before her, was the physical space, but no trace of the spirit that gave it life. Every modern detail that ignored its roots was like a brick being pulled from the foundation of her own story. No one recognized her, not a single good morning, not a welcome back, Dona Alzira. The rushed eyes of the staff passed over her as if she were invisible. The manager, buried in spreadsheets and performance metrics, didn't even notice the presence of that slow-walking, deep-gazing woman. And that hurt, because it wasn't about fame or ego. It was about recognition, about honoring those who came before. Alzira didn't want red carpets. She just wanted someone to know that that kitchen had a beginning, and that beginning had a name, a face, and a story. And sadly, this neglect isn't an isolated case. It reflects something that happens in many places. In the name of innovation, efficiency, and scale, we begin erasing the traces that brought us here. We cut ties to our origins as if they were loose ends. But what we forget is that the present only makes sense when it carries the weight, the sweat, and the lessons of the past. Companies, families, friendships, they all have a starting point. And when we stop revering those starting points, we lose more than memory. We lose identity. Think about how many stories have been lost because someone decided that new is always better than old. How many family recipes disappeared because no one wanted to learn from grandma. How many leadership lessons were forgotten because the founders didn't know how to make PowerPoint slides. How many core values were labeled outdated just because they didn't fit in a spreadsheet. Then one day, the whole structure collapses, and everyone wonders, where did we go wrong? The answer almost always lies in that dusty old frame, ignored in the back of the wall. What Alzira experienced that afternoon was a kind of silent grief. She didn't just lose recognition. She lost the right to be remembered, to be mentioned, to be celebrated, not as a relic of the past, but as the foundation of the present. The absence of institutional memory is a form of invisible violence. And the most dangerous part is that it doesn't hurt right away, but over time it corrodes bonds, dehumanizes environments, and turns once vibrant spaces into cold, functional places, stripped of meaning. At the end of that afternoon, just before leaving, Alzira stopped in front of the photo. She stared at it for several seconds, touched the glass with the tip of her fingers, and whispered, "You're still here, even if they don't know it." It wasn't a phrase of bitterness. It was a whisper of resilience. Because true stories have that kind of power. Even when ignored, they continue to exist. Even when untold, they keep beating. Even when the world forgets, they find ways to stay alive, even if only in the heart of someone who lived every line with truth. That scene teaches us something profound. It shows that tradition and innovation don't have to be enemies, that modernizing is not the same as erasing, that moving forward doesn't mean leaving everything behind. On the contrary, the strongest places are those that know how to unite the past and the future in harmony, that know how to honor their roots while growing in new directions, that understand a company's, a family's, or any institution's culture is built by those who came before and must be nurtured by those arriving now. So before jumping to the next management, marketing, or culinary trend, take a breath, take a step back, reread the old notes, listen to the older voices, revisit the first records. Try to understand what made that environment special, long before there was technology or performance metrics. Because the soul of a place isn't measured in numbers, it's measured in bonds. And bonds are made of stories. Maybe what your company is missing isn't more innovation, but more listening. Maybe what your team really needs isn't another productivity tool, but a heartfelt conversation with whoever laid the first bricks. Maybe what your heart is really searching for isn't a new path, but a reunion with the person you were before getting lost in the rush of the world. Alzira didn't return to the restaurant to cause a scene. She came to reconnect. But she ended up exposing, without saying a word, a mistake many people make, disregarding the invisible value of origin. And that's why this is not just a scene about a restaurant. The shift was almost over. The clock read 5:58 p.m., and the last customers were finishing their coffee while the staff, relieved that the shift was ending, exchanged tired glances. Between light jokes and automatic movements, no one noticed that Alzira was standing up, with the same serenity she once used to season the beans in the restaurant's early years. Her coat, old but clean, still carried the scent of cast-iron pans and a well-lived past. She walked to the counter and asked politely to speak. Her voice was gentle, but carried the firmness of someone who has seen a lot. Only then did everyone stop. All movement ceased. Cutlery rested on the tables and conversations fell silent. Alzira stood in the center like someone who knows they don't need a spotlight to hold authority. She took a deep breath and said clearly, "I am Alzira, founder of this restaurant." The impact was immediate. Time seemed to freeze, and the oxygen in the room vanished for a moment. It was as if all certainties evaporated with that one revelation. The manager, who up to that point hadn't even offered a "good afternoon," froze. She tried to hide her embarrassment with an awkward smile, but her eyes gave her away. She knew she had made a serious mistake. The other employees, some newly hired, exchanged glances, unsure where to look. They looked like children caught in the act, and no wonder. That elderly woman ignored for hours was the reason they were all there. Alzira didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. She simply looked around and let silence say what words could not. And what a silence it was. Dense, heavy, almost tangible. Because sometimes the loudest noise comes from what isn't said. And there, in that suffocating atmosphere, one of the restaurant's most transformative stories was being born. Memories began to surface. Some of the older staff started to recall the photos on the walls, the framed news clippings near the back door. Could that really be her? They wondered silently. And the answer was a resounding yes. She was the one who, back in the 80s, built a tiny counter out of salvaged wood and put up a hand-painted sign. She was the one who, day after day, cooked on a 2-burner stove to feed the construction workers in the area. And she was the one who, with a smile on her face, told every customer, "You're not just another plate here. You're part of our story." But over time, like many stories, her memory grew dusty. The new generations of staff didn't know who she was. The new manager, focused on metrics and quality control, had never bothered to learn the roots of the place she ran. The once warm service had become mechanical. Kindness turned into scripted lines, and empathy was replaced by rushed efficiency. Alzira's presence that day was like a mirror, a harsh reflection of the disconnect that had grown between past and present. And by introducing herself without an ounce of arrogance, she showed that true authority doesn't come from a name tag. It comes from silent construction, day after day, with calloused hands and a whole heart. What hurt the most wasn't the mistake itself, but the indifference that allowed it to happen. Because it wasn't just about forgetting a face, it was about failing to see the human being behind it. How many stories are silenced every day because someone seems too ordinary to be worth noticing? How many Alziras walk among us, invisible, just waiting for a kind look, a genuine listener, the smallest sign of respect? That restaurant began to change. Not by force, but through awareness. The once nervous gazes now sought Alzira's silent approval, and she, with the wisdom of someone who understands time, offered only a faint smile. It was the beginning of something bigger, a new chapter. The next day, the staff conversations had a different tone. The laughter was more contained, and the manager personally apologized, with sincere humility, not the kind from a corporate handbook. Alzira accepted, but asked for something in return. Treat every customer as if they could have founded this place, because deep down, they all helped build this story. From then on, changes happened naturally. Waiters began to look customers in the eyes. Please and thank you were no longer mere obligations. The photo wall was updated again, now with a special space for the restaurant's roots. And more than anything, staff started asking each other, "Do you know the story of the person beside you?" Alzira didn't return every day, but her name was now spoken with reverence, and her lesson, more powerful than any training, was etched in everyone's heart. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who enters and leaves a restaurant, a store, a company. It was about seeing beyond appearances, beyond the moment. It was about recovering the ability to see the human being before the role. And this is one of those stories that deserve to be told again and again, because they remind us that respect isn't an extra kindness. It's the starting point. That humility isn't weakness. It's the most elegant form of strength. And sometimes all it takes is one quiet gesture to completely turn around what once seemed unchangeable. In the midst of the uncomfortable silence, the young waiter who had cleaned the chair still felt the weight of everyone's gaze. His hands trembled slightly, like someone carrying a simple gesture that, for some reason, had become revolutionary in that context. He didn't know what to do with his body. He looked down, then sideways, as if searching for an escape. But before the discomfort turned into shame, Alzira, with her calm presence, walked over to him and embraced him. A slow embrace, without explanation, but full of meaning. And it was there, in the middle of the restaurant she had founded decades ago, that she whispered a sentence that changed everything. "You honored what is most precious in this place." That sentence wasn't just a compliment. It was a public and symbolic recognition of an essential value: respect. In an environment where everyone seemed more concerned with appearances, the young man's gesture had touched what truly matters. He wasn't looking for applause. He didn't seek a reward. He simply did what felt right. And because of that, he became great. This is one of those stories that remind us that humanity isn't taught in manuals, but passed on through example. And the most powerful part came right after. Without raising her voice, Alzira turned to everyone else and, with a confident smile, announced her decision. "From today on, he will be our new service supervisor." There was a brief murmur in the room. Some exchanged surprised glances. Others tried to hide their discomfort. But the truth was undeniable. The young man's gesture spoke louder than any resume. He wasn't promoted out of flattery or favoritism. He was promoted for something rare: quiet merit. In that moment, something shifted in many minds. That restaurant, which had already gone through many phases, was now beginning another of its stories. A phase of rescue, of reconnecting with its essence. Because in the end, it wasn't just about food. It was about welcoming, about noticing, about recognizing. And the one who had the courage to do that first was the youngest on the team, a young man who, until then, was barely noticed by his peers. But the impact didn't stop there. The promotion became the talk of every shift. Yet instead of envy, it sparked reflection. In the following days, the restaurant felt different. Conversations behind the scenes were no longer just about orders and shift changes. They began to include questions that no one used to ask. How was your day? Need a hand? Are you really okay? Simple questions that opened doors to big changes. And so, another quiet transformation began. The young man, now a supervisor, didn't change his ways. He kept the same discreet smile, the same care when serving at table, the same respect for every customer who walked in. But now he had become a reference, not because of the title, but because of his attitude, for having the courage to act with empathy when it would have been easier to pretend not to see. It's incredible how some stories are written in minutes, but remain in a place's memory forever. Alzira, observant as always, realized that moment could be the starting point for something bigger. She invited the team leaders for a special meeting. "What happened here," she said, "is exactly what I always dreamed this restaurant would be. A place where real people connect, where no one has to play a role, where respect isn't demanded, it's practiced." And she left them with a challenge. that each leader should identify and publicly celebrate small acts of greatness within their teams. A new tradition was born. That's when the Wall of Inspiring Stories was created. Each month, one action was highlighted. Not the most productive, but the most human. A kitchen assistant who helped a new colleague without being asked. A hostess who noticed an elderly customer's anxiety and walked her to the table holding her hand. A glass washer who, despite being exhausted, offered part of his lunch to a delivery person who had missed theirs. Each gesture was handwritten, the person's name in bold, and read aloud at the monthly team meeting. The whole staff began to look forward to that moment. Interestingly, operational results also improved. Customer numbers went up, staff turnover dropped, complaint rates plummeted, but all of that came as a consequence, not as the goal. The essence was something else. The essence was in the stories. Every employee began to understand that when you act with awareness, the environment responds, and sooner or later, the world gives back. The young waiter's promotion became a symbol of that, but not everything was smooth. Some employees, more resistant to change, tried to discredit the movement. They called it a trend, a passing thing, or claimed, no one keeps that up for long. But facts proved more stubborn than criticism, and over time even the skeptics began to notice. The atmosphere had become lighter, the relationships more genuine, the smiles more honest, and all of it because of a single gesture from someone who cleaned a chair and offered a seat when no one else did. That's why it's worth repeating. Never underestimate the power of a simple gesture. Never believe kindness is weakness, because the greatest stories don't come from grand speeches. They come from small decisions. Decisions made in silence. Decisions born of character, not status. And above all, decisions that happen even when no one is watching. Or better yet, when everyone is pretending not to. So now tell me honestly, how many times have you failed to act with empathy because you thought it wasn't your job? How many chances to be human have you ignored just because the environment didn't encourage it? Because if there's one thing this story teaches, it's that the change you're waiting for might just begin with you. You don't need recognition, or a title, or permission. You just need awareness and courage. The next day, the restaurant woke up different, not in its walls, menu, or uniforms. The change was invisible, but tangible. It was in the air, in the glances, in the slower, more mindful steps of those arriving for another day of work. Alzira, quietly, called a meeting, but she made it clear from the start. This isn't to point fingers, it's to open minds. The room where everyone gathered was quiet, curious. No one knew exactly what to expect, but there was a kind of respect in the air, the kind that only comes when someone earns it without forcing. And with the same grace with which she had always led, Alzira began to speak. There was no scolding tone, only the voice of someone who carries life in her words. She spoke of respect, of empathy, of presence. And then she said a sentence that pierced each of them like a well-aimed arrow. The best stories begin with those who choose to truly see others. That sentence fell like a necessary silence. It was as if each person there had been invited to revisit not just their last shift, but their own conscience. Alzira then told stories, not the grand ones that end up in magazines, but the small ones, the ones that transform quietly. She remembered the restaurant's early years, how she made a point to learn every customer's name, how she'd sit at tables even if just for 2 minutes just to listen. What brought people back wasn't just the food, it was the care, she said. And that's when a simple question came, one that carried a huge weight. What are you serving besides the plate? No one answered right away, because the question wasn't meant to be answered with words. It was meant to be digested. Deep down, she knew, a restaurant can serve food, but it can also serve warmth, respect, dignity, and listening. And each of these things is an ingredient of something bigger, a culture sustained by real, human, heartfelt stories. From that day on, something began to shift. Not because Alzira imposed rules, but because she awakened consciousness. The training changed. It started to include active listening, emotional intelligence, body language reading. It was no longer just about knowing the menu or mastering service techniques. It was about understanding people, reading silences, noticing when a customer needed a glance more than a dessert. And something beautiful began to happen. The staff themselves started sharing their experiences. At the end of each shift, they gathered to tell stories. not just about what went well, but also about when they got it wrong and learned. The environment, once mechanical and automatic, came to life. Smiles stopped being protocol and became real. Questions like, "Are you okay?" were asked with genuine interest, not just politeness. The stories began to spread. There was the waiter who noticed a customer staring into space, started a conversation, and found out he'd just come from a funeral. The dishwasher realized that an elderly woman returned every Saturday, not for the dish of the day, but because it was the only place where someone remembered her name. And the intern who, after receiving a rude comment, took a deep breath and responded with empathy, only to see that same customer return days later, embarrassed and thankful for her kindness. These stories began to be written down in a notebook kept open in the break room for anyone to read or write in. It became a kind of invisible mural, where experiences were captured in ink and emotion. And in that notebook, Alzira wrote a sentence that became the restaurant's motto: "Serving is different from attending, and living is different from merely passing by." Little by little, even the customers started noticing the difference. Some asked, "What changed here?" Others just came back more often. Many left thank you notes, compliments, even personal stories about how they felt seen in that place. It was as if the restaurant had become an antidote to the rush, indifference, and automation of the outside world. And it's curious how a change so subtle can transform everything. Revenue went up, but no one talked about that. The focus was on essence. Employees began to feel proud of where they worked. They felt part of something that went beyond tasks. After all, they were building stories, and every action, no matter how small, was a brick in that legacy. Alzira, with her white hair and gentle voice, never needed to hold big meetings again. Her presence was enough. She would walk through the halls and be greeted not out of obligation, but admiration. New employees, in their first days, were introduced to the notebook's stories, and they understood right then and there that this place was more than a job. It was a space where respect was a required ingredient. With time, new habits began forming. A board titled "Story of the Week" was placed in the dining area. People were moved. They laughed. They reflected. It was a constant reminder that humanity can't be taught with a manual. It's shared through lived experience. And those stories were the ultimate proof that when we choose to truly see others, the world changes its colors. Today, the restaurant is not known just for its food. It's known for its atmosphere, its culture, the feeling that when you walk in, you're not just a number, you're someone. And that didn't come from a marketing campaign. It came from a gesture, a phrase, a silent meeting that became a revolution. Days after that quiet yet powerful meeting shook the restaurant's foundations. A subtle but deeply symbolic addition appeared near the entrance. It was a mural, a panel of aged wood, with simple frames and soft lighting, installed where once there had been a cold, blank wall. But what truly moved people wasn't the material, it was the content. People would stop, feel emotional, take pictures. It wasn't decoration, it was memory. There were black and white photos from decades past. Customers, now grandparents, smiling beside simple dishes. Staff with worn aprons but eyes full of dignity. Children blowing out birthday candles. Couples toasting special moments. And hugs. So many hugs. Each photo carried such emotional weight, it felt like they were whispering to passers-by, "You're part of this story too." And that's when the atmosphere truly began to shift, without anyone needing to say a word. Eyes that once avoided contact out of haste or habit began to meet. Customers who came just for a quick meal began returning for something deeper, a sense of belonging. There was a new kind of silence in the air. Not the cold kind of indifference, but the respectful silence of someone who realizes they are inside something bigger than themselves. A shared story. At the center of the mural, carefully embroidered on a piece of aged linen and framed in golden letters, was the phrase that summed it all up. Here, no one is too small to deserve respect, and no one is too great to not need humility. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a principle. A daily reminder that dignity isn't measured by appearance, salary, or title, and that every person, without exception, has a story worth hearing. That phrase became a table conversation, a photo caption, a lesson passed from parents to children. People who once barely nodded in hallways now exchanged sincere good mornings. The cooks, whose names were rarely known, started receiving thank you notes from customers. "Your seasoning tastes like childhood," said one. Even the younger staff, newly hired, began to understand they weren't just there to serve meals, but to continue a living story. And all of this teaches us something powerful. When you honor your roots, you strengthen your present. That goes for anything: a business, a friendship, a project, even yourself. Because what sustains us on hard days isn't praise from strangers, but the memories of those who walked with us for so long. They are the stories we keep close, even when life pushes us to forget. You know that old photo you've kept in a drawer? The one you almost threw out during the last cleanup? Maybe it's time to take it out, to look at it with new eyes, to recognize that behind every wrinkle, every stain, every yellowed paper, there's a story that shaped you. Because those who forget where they came from risk getting lost, without even realizing it. Back at the restaurant, small rituals began to emerge. Once a month, employees would gather to share their own stories. One talked about the grandmother who taught him to cook. Another, about the father who dreamed of owning a restaurant but never got the chance. And Dona Alzira, in her quiet wisdom, would simply listen and smile, because she knew that when people feel heard, they bloom. And believe me, the customer notices. They notice when a place has soul, when the waiter looks you in the eye, when the host remembers your name, when the place honors the past while embracing the present. That's what makes a restaurant unforgettable. It's not just the food, it's the taste of the stories that season every detail. There was a curious episode that illustrates this perfectly. An elderly lady entered the restaurant and began to cry in front of the mural. A concerned employee approached her, and she explained, "This one here was my husband. We used to come here every Sunday. It's been 20 years since he passed, but seeing this photo here made me feel like he's still with me." It struck a deep chord. The employee didn't know what to say. He simply held her hand. And in that gesture, another story was born. It didn't take long for other businesses in the region to try and replicate the model. But something curious happened. None could recreate the effect. Because it's not about a mural, a pretty phrase, or marketing. It's about truth, coherence. Cultivating a space where each person's story has value, where no one is invisible, where serving goes beyond the plate. It's an act of humanity. And that raises an important question. How have you been treating the stories that cross your path? Have you been paying attention? Have you truly listened? Or do you only notice what's convenient, what's quick, what doesn't require effort? Because the way you deal with other people's stories says a lot about the story you're writing for yourself. Maybe, without even realizing, you're surrounded by living memories, just waiting for a little recognition, a more attentive look, a sincere thank you, a tell me more about that. Because sometimes a recovered detail can reignite the light in someone who thought they had already faded away. And it's these little sparks that keep great stories alive. So next time you enter a place, be it a restaurant, a bus, a meeting, or even a casual conversation, remember, everyone has a past, and every past holds a story. The difference is, not everyone has someone willing to hear it. But if you choose to be that person, rest assured, you'll be contributing to a world with more empathy, more respect, and more meaning. Because at the end of the day, what truly connects people isn't data, profits, or titles. It's the stories they carry. And the more we honor that, the more human everything becomes. Dona Alzira's story was not confined to the discreet walls of that corner restaurant. What seemed like an ordinary day gained a whole new meaning when, amid glances of disdain and hushed whispers, the truth emerged. That elderly lady with white hair, simple clothes, and slow steps was none other than the founder of that restaurant. And not just that. She was the living force behind dozens of stories that had shaped that space over 4 decades. The moment of revelation, though unplanned, was captured by one of the customers who, curious about the strange atmosphere in the room, began discreetly recording what was happening. Just a few seconds, a gesture, a glance, a phrase spoken with firmness, were enough for the video to go viral on social media. In less than 24 hours, thousands of people were commenting, sharing, and above all, moved by what they had witnessed. It wasn't an ad. There was no professional editing, no soundtrack. But it had something rare in today's world: truth. And when truth finds a willing heart, it doesn't just touch, it transforms. The restaurant, once just another in the city, became a symbol of something much greater, the awakening of dormant awareness. Dona Alzira's story exposed a daily, often invisible wound: prejudice disguised as routine, The automatic judgment so many people apply without even realizing it. With the buzz, former regulars began to return. People who had celebrated birthdays there in the 90s, who brought their kids for Sunday lunches, who kept napkin notes with love messages exchanged across tables. Some were moved to tears when they saw that Dona Alzira was still there, in the flesh, silent, yet ever present. Others brought old photos, living memories, even forgotten objects from times that seemed long gone. And the newcomers? They came out of curiosity, but stayed because of authenticity. There was no forced attempt to please, no rehearsed pitch to attract customers. There were real people living a story that now belonged to everyone. The restaurant began each new employee training with Alzira's narrative. On their very first day, new hires would listen in silence to the recording of the scene, watch the viral video, and hear a testimonial from the founder herself. The message was clear. Here, we don't just serve food. Here, we serve respect. Here, every tray carries a lesson. Every glance is an invitation to empathy. And it didn't take long for the culture to shift. The staff's attitude transformed. The service now came with a sparkle in the eye, and even the way the cutlery was placed got more attention. Because everything there, no matter how small, told a story. But what stood out the most was how frequently customers began sharing their own experiences. Handwritten notes were left on tables. Accounts of overcoming hardships, reunions, forgiveness, and new beginnings. The restaurant became a small sanctuary of real stories. A makeshift mural with string and clothespins displayed the messages. The walls gained more than decoration. They gained soul. And that reflection, which began with a silent judgment, didn't stop there. Every time someone rushed in and saw an elderly lady being treated with kindness, that story came back to mind. Every time a staff member held the door for a struggling customer or patiently listened to a complaint, the echo of that morning was renewed. Because small gestures, when done with truth, become seeds of change. More than a restaurant, that space turned into a quiet movement. Local schools started using Dona Alzira's story as a case study. Teachers began discussing generational respect, everyday empathy, and the power of assumptions with their students. Companies sent teams to have lunch there and join discussion circles with the staff. And Dona Alzira, without ever seeking it, became a symbol, not of fame, but of awareness. It's curious how little it takes to change the world, and yet how much the world resists change. A woman with white hair, sitting in silence, achieved what many motivational speeches never do. She touched hearts, because there's no truth more powerful than the one disguised in simplicity. And the greatest stories are like that. They are born quietly, but remain where it matters most, in memory and in conscience. Today, when someone walks into that restaurant and asks, "Who is that lady in the photo?" the answer comes with a smile and a sparkle in the eye. That's Dona Alzira, the woman who founded this place, the one who taught us that respect isn't a bonus, it's the bare minimum. And when they hear that, many lower their heads, not in shame, but in recognition. After all, what defines a person isn't what they wear or how they appear. It's what they build, even when no one is watching. It's the legacy they leave in each gesture. It's the way they turn judgment into learning and silence into revolution. And that's why this story keeps being told. Because as long as someone is willing to listen, it will keep echoing. More than that, it will inspire new stories. It will move others to stand up against injustice, to look into the eyes of those who have been made invisible, to act, even when no one is watching. Because the extraordinary lives in the ordinary, and the most beautiful revolutions are born from silent acts of respect. So now I ask you sincerely, how many times have you judged someone without even hearing the story behind that face? It didn't have to be out loud or through obvious gestures. It could have been that automatic, almost invisible thought that slips into your mind without permission. They must be an employee. Probably can't afford much. Bet they don't even know where they are. Yeah, we judge quickly. And often, we judge wrongly. You know what's most cruel about that? While we're judging, we stop listening. We stop seeing. We stop perceiving what truly matters. We miss out on valuable opportunities for connection, for learning, for humility. Because behind every simple appearance, there's a lifetime of experience, battles, and stories that could completely change our worldview, if only we had the heart to truly listen. This isn't just a story about a restaurant. It's a mirror that shows us that behind a janitor's uniform, There might be the founder of the company, that behind white hair and modest clothes. There could be someone who built that place with their bare hands. But what's most striking isn't the reveal. It's people's reaction, the discomfort, the shame, the regret of realizing, too late, that they treated with contempt someone who deserved deep respect. How many times has that happened to you? How many times have you ignored someone just because they didn't seem worth a second look? Maybe it was in the elevator, in the bank line, at the grocery checkout, or at that Sunday lunch where someone didn't quite match the occasion. The truth is, life constantly gives us chances to rethink our beliefs, but we only learn when we're willing to pause, to feel, and, most importantly, to change. Because the problem isn't the mistake, it's repeating it. It's the indifference. It's continuing to mistreat those who have nothing to offer you in return. And then comes the haunting, but healing question. What will you do the next time you cross paths with someone who seems invisible? Will you repeat the mistake? Or will you write a new story? It's not about being nice, it's about being just. It's about realizing that behind every simple gesture lies a chance to do things differently, to inspire, to transform the environment around you. And it doesn't matter if you're the owner, the employee, the customer, or the intern. Respect is a two-way street. And humility. Humility is the only uniform that never goes out of style. This story is about Dona Alzira, but it's also about you, about me, about all of us. Because every day life puts a Dona Alzira in our path, someone who carries years of dedication, courage, and service, and who is still ignored by those who only see the surface. The saddest part? Many of these stories go unnoticed. They die in silence. And with them, a part of our humanity dies too. The good news is, it's never too late to turn the page. There's always a chance to write a new chapter, and that chance begins with a gesture, a look, the recognition that no one is too small to be treated with dignity, and no one is too important to forget that. Because the world already has too many critics, what it needs is more people who truly see others. So let me ask you, when was the last time you were surprised by someone everyone else overlooked? Do you remember what it felt like? The impact it had? The shame you felt for having underestimated them? Or maybe the genuine admiration that bloomed when you discovered who that person really was? These are the stories that leave marks, not because they hurt, but because they teach. And if this reflection touched you, if it lit something inside you, then do this. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications, but above all, carry this with you. Take it to work. Take it home. Take it to the bakery line. Because it's in those places, behind the scenes of everyday life, that we build the stories that are truly worth telling. Here, every piece of content is an invitation for you to grow, inside and out. And don't be fooled. Growing isn't about accumulating power, money, or recognition. Growing is about being able to kneel to hear the ones no one else wants to listen to. It's about recognizing greatness in those the world insists on ignoring. In the end, it's about learning to be human, every single day. So before we wrap up, drop this in the comments. When was the last time you learned something from someone who seemed to have nothing to teach? Share your story. Who knows? Maybe it will inspire someone else. Maybe it will be the spark that helps someone see the world with new eyes. Because the most powerful stories aren't the ones we watch. They're the ones we live. And if you want, there's still time to live a new one today.